Welcome, everyone, to today's program presented by Main Street America to recap the COVID-19 Small Business Research Report that was produced by Main Street America about a week ago. My name is Kelly Hummerkaiser. I'm the Manager of Education here at Main Street America. I also have with us today our Director of Research, Mike Poe, and our Vice President of Revitalization Programs, Matt Wagner. Mike and Matt will be presenting both the data from the research report as well as a section of policy implications on research. And then we'll end the program with accessing individual results of the research report for communities that reported in and states. So if you're interested in how to access that data, make sure to hang with us till the end of the program. Before we begin the program today, I want to take a moment to ensure our audience understands the webinar platform. Mike, you can move to the next slide, please. Please note, you are automatically muted. You may either use your telephone or computer audio. You can control that choice under the audio section of your control panel. We welcome you to submit your questions at any time during the program. We'll probably take the bulk of questions at the end, but please do chat your questions in so we can gain an understanding of what the most pressing questions are, and then also address any tech needs that you might have. We're here to support you for that too. If you are have a lingering question after today's program or a question that was unaddressed, please do send us an email, mainstreet@savingplaces.org. We'll make sure that that question goes to the right person for the answer. We do expect a packed audience today, and if you're unable to remain with us throughout the entire program, or you know of someone else that wanted to join us today but was unable, please note that a recording of this presentation will be available in about 24 hours on our Main Street COVID Resources webpage. I also want to point you to the handout section of your control panel where you will find a copy of today's slides in case you want to follow along. Next slide, please, Mike. We just want to remind you before we kick off as well about all of the resources that are available on the mainstreet.org/COVID-19 resources webpage. There we have been agglomerating all of the different sorts of support that are coming out for programs across this country and for your businesses. So we have federal and national resources, tools, other webinars we've been doing over the past 3 weeks, as well as those from partner organizations. And of course, we always encourage you to use our form on the site to submit any unique ideas, whether they be in support of local businesses, social media, advocacy. Use the form on the site to share with us what you are doing so that we can get word out to the rest of the network. And with that, now I will turn it over to Mike to get us started talking today about the research report.
All right, thank you, Kelly. So hi everyone, I'm Mike Poe. I'm the Director of Research for the National Main Street Center. Pretty new to the job. I just joined Main Street in early March. It's been a strange time to join an organization, just as COVID-19 was sort of becoming a reality for all of us. I was thrilled to join the team, and not so thrilled to have this great research project to do because of the sort of challenges that it reveals. So we, of course, are interested in how COVID-19 is impacting small businesses. I think it's clear that looking out the window, wherever you are, reading the news, small businesses are hurting. There's a lot of very sort of dramatic stories out there, but we didn't feel like there was very clear data on how small businesses, especially very small businesses, are doing, especially in rural places and places throughout the country. So we conducted this survey using SurveyMonkey in late March, early April, and we're very pleased, and I was a little surprised to get 5,851 responses. 5,851 small business owners responded to the survey. Those surveys came in from more than 2,500 communities across the U.S. and all lower 48 states, and plus DC. I think the orange This orange map is not quite right. It's missing a few states, I think. 40% of our responses came from communities with fewer than 10,000 residents. So we're capturing a lot of small town, kind of rural America in the survey. So I'm going to run through some of the data on the kinds of businesses we heard from. I'm going to run through the survey responses broadly. Toward the end, I'll get into some of the sort of insights that you may not have, if you've already read the report, that you may not have seen. But for now, I'm going to talk through a little bit about what we saw in the data. So first of all, some descriptive questions about the kinds of businesses that responded. This is the result of that question. About 40% represented food service industry, non-food retail. Those are the largest two groups. You will see there's this other category there at the bottom, almost 27% for other. Pretty striking and surprising. My colleague, Tanae Batts at the National Main Street Center helped dig through some of that information. It looks like there's a lot of arts organizations, entertainment-focused businesses, fitness centers, and gyms that were listed there. And then oddly enough, there were a bunch of businesses that appeared to fall into the other categories, food service and accommodations in particular, but were listed as other. We asked how long the businesses had been in operation, and nearly half of the sample, probably overrepresented relative to all small businesses in the United States, had been in operation for more than 10 years. So we have quite a lot of long operating businesses in our survey respondent sample. Next, we asked how business owners would characterize the ownership of the business, whether locally owned, out-of-state ownership, et cetera. Pretty striking, yeah, 3/4 of the business respondents represent locally owned businesses, and more than half were women-owned businesses. We also heard in the other category on this one, it was interesting, Tanae Batts helped me look through that a little bit, and there are family-owned businesses, husband and wife-owned businesses. People called out the LGBTQ-owned businesses, and quite a number of veteran-owned businesses. So, you know, a really diverse sample, broad swaths of the United States represented in the ownership of these businesses. We asked some questions about sort of the characteristics of the business, where they operate, whether the business owns or leases the business space. This is pretty self-explanatory. Close to 40% of the businesses own the space that they occupy and operate the business out of. Close to 60% lease. And then there's this residual, a little more than 3% that don't actually have a physical space. Getting into the number of employees. So our sample, you know, really focuses, I think, on businesses with fewer than 20 employees, very small businesses. More than 90% of the businesses that filled out the survey have fewer than 20 employees. Considering the Small Business Administration considers, I think it's anything less than 200 employees a small business. We're really focused on just the smallest set of those, which actually represents the bulk of all small businesses, even according to the SBA, but for what it's worth. We asked about online sales, the degree to which the businesses have an online sales component to their business and how much revenue it generates. A little bit surprised and striking that almost 2/3 of the small business respondents don't have an e-commerce component to the work that they do. And if you look at the actual revenue generated by e-commerce, really we're talking about a very small percentage of the businesses, about 7% generate more than 1/4 of their revenue through their online component. So perhaps this is an opportunity, especially given the times that we're in and the COVID-19 crisis and the nature of it. We could build this out a little bit more, but be curious to talk about that in the Q&A perhaps. So now we're going to sort of get into some of the impacts of COVID-19 on small businesses, the sort of focus of the survey. So first, we asked the question, has your business suspended storefront operations as a result of the COVID-19 public health emergency? Close to 80% said that yes, they had. I still haven't separated this out by state. I'm keen to do that to see how this relates to stay at home, the shelter in place kind of orders. I'll bet there's a strong correlation there. So now we're getting to the real sort of the impact as it really affects local economies and people throughout these places. So we asked how many of your employees are at risk of unemployment and or layoffs as a result of the coronavirus. And we saw that nearly 3/4 of respondents said they had at least one employee at risk of unemployment, nearly 75%. And we took a look at the data for just those businesses that had also said they had 5 or fewer employees. We were curious, because it'd be unlikely that those businesses would answer the latter categories. So if we do look at just those businesses that have 5 employees or fewer, 85% of those businesses said that one or more of their employees is in jeopardy of losing their job. So quite extreme here. We asked how COVID-19 has affected business owners' livelihoods here, and kind of get the sense looking at this chart, looking at this data, there are all sorts of impacts. You sort of name the impact of the business and people, are going through it basically. So for instance, the real bottom line here, the loss of revenue, 90.2% of businesses reported a loss of revenue. That jumps to the top. The only one that really didn't emerge at all was the change in insurance rates. So apparently insurance rates have not really fluctuated following COVID-19, at least not yet, as 1.6% there. Also interesting, the sort of categories, the green and gray toward the bottom. We asked about whether businesses had established or enhanced a secondary or alternative mode of business operation related to perhaps selling and delivering products. Given a lot of the storefront operations may be kind of coming to a halt. And I was sort of surprised that maybe it's a positive that 36% established an alternative mode of business operation to do this, to sort of adapt to the crisis. Close to 24% enhanced their secondary mode of business operation. That could be a pretty good percent, but looking at the impacts overall here on this chart, it's one of the lower responses. Next, how business revenue has changed since COVID-19 became a widespread concern. And here, the chart is very dramatic. The results are very dramatic, pretty staggering. So 94%, if you add up all of the columns that have all the bars that say decrease, 94% of businesses had some revenue loss. More than 70% had their revenue cut in half or worse. And more than half of the businesses saw their revenue drop by more than 75%. So a truly, just as dramatic and sort of breathtaking as it could be. Looking at the other side of that coin, only about 1 in 20 respondents said that their revenues were pretty normal, that's 4.5%. And about 1 in 70 businesses actually saw a revenue increase. So considering, 94% seeing a loss, 1 in 70 seeing an increase, get the kind of quick sense of nationally what this means. And maybe one of the most dramatic questions here in responses, if the business disruption continues at the current rate, how soon will their business be at risk of closing permanently? So about 1/3 of businesses said they would likely shutter within 2 months if the crisis didn't abate. And about 2/3 said they would have to close down operations permanently within 5 months. So, it's easy to talk about the numbers here. It's easy to say 1/3, 2/3, and that'd be an abstraction. But to think of the impact for so many business owners, their employees, the commercial districts, if 2/3 of the storefronts are closed down, what does that mean for local economies? And again, it's pretty breathtaking. So a real crisis on our hands here. I'm sure I don't need to share that. You all know it as well or better than I do, certainly. A few more questions here, and I'll get to some takeaways before passing it to Matt to talk about some of the policy implications and sort of programmatic implications. So we asked the question at this time, what are you most concerned about? And as with the impacts to businesses, business owners, it appears, are concerned about a real variety of things. Losing work, about 2/3 of the responses. This is one where people could check more than one box. So about 2/3 of respondents said they were concerned about losing work. They're concerned about the impact on payroll, making payroll, paying rent, their employees' financial welfare, customer traffic. You see 40%, a little more than 40% are concerned about accessing government support. Headlines in the news today and certainly this week about the deployment of those funds, a real concern. I'm sure Matt will get into that a little bit more. And then finally, we asked what types of assistance would be most helpful to your business. And I was pretty struck by this one. This is another one where respondents could check as many boxes as they thought appropriate. But quickly you see that sort of things like guidance, information, technical training really pale in comparison to sort of bottom line survival, the two boxes there. So it's 70% and 65%. Financial assistance extensions on expenses. I think it could be an interpretation of this that folks are really concerned about the bottom line, about keeping the business going. It is a little surprising to me, and it could be the wording of the question. It could be where people's psyche is at the moment they fill out the survey. But you see things like 16.6%, the dark blue line, for technical training on e-commerce. Where e-commerce is relatively rare among this respondent set, it's pretty striking that so few respondents checked that box. On the other hand, it could be that technical training and not actually delivery and deployment of something that could actually generate revenue immediately is not necessarily as of immediate interest. Similar with the delivery option there, the sort of turquoise box, 10%. Information on cost and risk for providing new services like delivery. Not a very popular option. So I'm going to go through just some of the quick takeaways. So we took these results and we thought about the sort of broader universe across the U.S. of small businesses, and especially given our categories of food service businesses, accommodations, recreation, professional services, and healthcare. We looked at the SBA data, the Small Business Administration data, and there's 11.6 million small businesses in those industries across the country. So if we apply our, roughly 1/3 of businesses can stay afloat for 1 to 2 months, and only 2/3 may go out of business within 5 months, we're talking about 3.5 million small businesses at risk of shuttering permanently within 2 months. And 7.5 million small businesses at risk or jeopardy of shuttering within 5 months. Truly probably unprecedented in American history. It's often said, but in this case might actually be true. Now we turn again to that revenue change response, where we saw that 72% of small businesses had seen their revenues halved. And you think about the bottom line then and paying employees. So we looked at the data here, again, on employees at risk of unemployment or layoffs. And we did a little extrapolation work looking at the midpoint of these categories and applying that to those same industries. So it looks like by our projection, about 35.7 million Americans working in food service, accommodations, recreation, professional services, and healthcare are in jeopardy of losing their jobs or in jeopardy of unemployment as a result of COVID-19 and the crisis here. Given today's headlines that 22 million people have now filed for unemployment over the last few weeks, I sadly feel pretty good about our estimate of 35.7 million. I think we're pretty accurate, but you can't feel too positive about something like that overall. So I have done some work digging deeper into the data, slicing up to look at geography, look at types of businesses, look at age of businesses, and start to see sort of the trends within some of these things. So first off, geography. I pulled in census data on population counts to look at how the different places where we had responses, surveys come in, how they're affected. And it appears that the impacts of COVID-19 are fairly indiscriminate when it comes to rural versus urban, small towns versus big cities. So, regardless if a community has 10,000 residents or 100,000, pretty close to 33% of respondents said that their businesses would close within 2 months. And again, pretty close to 66%, 2/3 said that their business would close within 5 months, regardless of the kind of context, the size of the population. Small towns did foresee somewhat less risk of job loss, of unemployment. I can't quite, I don't know how to characterize that or explain that, but the data was a little bit trended that way. So businesses shuttering, similar rates, but unemployment a little bit less of a concern, at least in the minds of small business owners in small towns, places with less than 10,000 residents. So in terms of types of businesses, a sort of sector analysis here, food service businesses were clearly the hardest hit. So just to run through some of the dramatic stats for food service, more than 90% of food service businesses reported at least one employee was at risk of being laid off. 44% of food service businesses said they were likely to permanently close if the crisis didn't abate within 2 months, compared to, I think, 33% was the overall rate. And then 85% of food service businesses reported that the revenue had been halved or worse since this became a widespread concern in early March. Looking at retail, also very hard hit, probably the next worst. 82% of retail businesses reported that their revenue had been halved or worse since early March. And then between retail and food service, fewer than 25% of those businesses think they could hold out for longer than 5 months. And that's compared to about 40% of all other non-food service, non-retail businesses. So fewer than 25 with those categories, food, retail, and food service. About 4 in 10 of all other businesses think they could survive 5 months or longer. And then just some data on the age of businesses. So we see some data, some indication that fewer businesses that have been operating longer than 10 years or more, evidence that they reported, fewer of those businesses reported the most dramatic revenue losses. So long operating businesses appear to have somewhat better, they're impacted a little bit less in terms of revenue losses, but the flip side of that coin, you can't feel very good about. So nearly 3 in 4 businesses in operation for less than 10 years expect to permanently close if the crisis doesn't abate in the next 5 months. Again, you think about older commercial corridor, commercial district, and 3 in 4 businesses would be just devastating. So I'm going to pass the microphone, the baton, to Matt Wagner, and come back in a little bit to show the data. Oh, you go, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone to the webinar this afternoon. Appreciate everyone joining. Did want to make note that we intend to look at this the survey as a more of a longitudinal study, which I think also makes it rather unique, and so appreciative that Mike is with us and we're able to take these deeper dives into not only the anecdotal but also the real data that helps us to think about programming and in some cases policy implications as well. And so I'm going to share some early thoughts with you. I think the key is that this is quite a bit of a challenge in that it's so ever changing. I think we all recognize how fast you hear, one blip one day and then the next it can be quite different. There's lots of dialogue around the country, currently around reopening timelines, which could also be quite uneven, geographically dispersed, could be business dispersed in terms of who can, who can't, and certainly there will be implications for how that looks as well, depending on the kind of business that you are. So this is our opportunity, at least at this point in time, but recognize that as we acquire more data, see what happens from a public policy side federally and with different states. Some of this could ebb and flow as well. So the first thing that's really obvious, I think, from the data, and speaks to the strengths in many respects of how Main Streets operate, is that we definitely need connectors. There is a void here that's pretty obvious with some of the data that we see, and that 40% of small business really had concerns about their ability to access some of the COVID-19 financial programs, and that's really coming through. And just today, the headlines around PPP being used and then used up, no longer available. At this point, the funding's gone, or has been allocated, I should say. It's not out the door by any means. And then the EIDL, the emergency disaster funds, has also been tapped. But what you see is that, frankly, many small businesses had trouble accessing those funds, and it's taking quite a bit of time for those funds to reach small business owners. And so there's quite a bit of problems there. And I think, the role of Main Street in being able to educate small businesses and help them along the way is ever critical, and will remain critical through this process. I put a website, and I want to thank Kelly on our team for locating this, but it's covidloantracker.com. It's sort of a crowdsourced site about the various stats from day to day on folks that are receiving, who's receiving, which states are performing the best. If you're curious, as it stands now, the top 5 states where businesses are receiving PPP, it's looking like Texas, Georgia, California, Wisconsin, and Illinois, top 5. And then on the emergency disaster funds, which are the sort of emergency grants that have been occurring, or forgivable loans, we've got California, Florida, Texas, New York, and Georgia being the top there. In terms of just from a policy or ways that we can react to what's been happening, certainly there's a lot of dialogue right now at the federal level. You're seeing in the media just as much as I am about adding more funds to these particular programs. I think it's likely that will happen, but certainly there are some there's some banter going back and forth, as you can imagine, and certainly at what size, what level there'll be additional funds that are coming with those particular programs. Some of the changes that have occurred that I think hopefully we can take advantage of is that, I think there's a big role for us in helping to small businesses engage with their local banking institutions and with fintech institutions like PayPal and Quicken that have also are now part, and Square, I believe, are now part of this particular package. Because certainly one of the things that we're hearing anecdotally, and I think the data supports, that if you don't have strict banking relationships, many times you were cut out from the deals, especially through the large banks, or if you didn't have loans already in place. And so I think community banks, fintech organizations, that sort of thing. But I think that's where Main Streets can play a key role, and there may be even funding opportunities, support from your local banks to help make those connections. And then on the federal side, we'd like to see more CDFIs be part of this. Right now, they're not part of the program, but given their mission-driven aspects, as well as USDA on the rural side, right now they're not part of the lending framework for these programs. This would be a great opportunity to extend that out and perhaps reach more of the critical businesses that we have. If you're interested in supporting more of those efforts, and we'll have some more details coming out on this, but certainly the small business majority I think relates on a policy side very well to the kinds of businesses that we work with on Main Street. And you can take a look at their policy agenda. We've posted their website here, which addresses these things. We've had a number of conversations with them. And I think on a federal side, this is a really good approach to expand these funds in some other institutions that are much more mission driven, perhaps, than some of the other institutions are. I think another thing that we're seeing through the data is that this disconnect on the small business and entrepreneurship training provision. So as part of the CARES Act, the SBDCs, Women and Minority Business Centers, all across the U.S. are part of a $265 million package that was granted through SBA that will be providing primarily for capacity building, and then obviously through additional education and training opportunities. And so in many ways, this is part of that connectivity aspect. One of the issues, and you can see in this map, is there's quite a bit of sort of density issues or spatial distribution issues within SBDCs. And we think there's some opportunities to better address that in terms of really helping many of the small businesses that you see come up in the survey results. There's a drastic need for technical assistance on a number of different levels that's probably not being met at this point. So if you reflect back on the survey and what Mike was describing as potentially 7.5 million small businesses could permanently close, cease operations over the next 5 months. Just those details alone mean that for every SBDC, there's essentially over 6,000 severely impacted small businesses. That's not a great ratio in terms of the ability to support those folks through this time period. So because there's not just the financial side, of making connections to these various programs, but there's a lot of technical aspects of, operations, inventory, managing through crisis. There's a lot on e-commerce issues right now. And so we think that there's a disconnect between the availability of centers and what the funding is looking to do. It also doesn't just take into effect that many of the areas around the country are just grossly underserved by SBDCs. And so it's not certainly not a knock against the work of SBDCs. They do wonderful work with small businesses. They're great partners with Main Streets all across the country. But $265 million, given what we're seeing in the data, seems really underfunded at this point. So we're certainly encouraging on a federal level the U.S. Small Business Administration and certainly political leadership to look to expand these resources and expand our thinking around, especially in the short term, the ability for SBDCs to scale in the short term is very problematic. And so we think it's worthwhile to extend some of those resources to partner organizations. So think of it as an extension of SBDCs to other partner organizations like Main Streets or chambers or local economic development organizations that are commonly working with small business owners, especially in terms of making connections with technical and financial resources. Why not make them part of the support so that Main Street programs and the like could also be receiving or have access to some of that funding to do the good work and making those connections and providing that assistance. I think in sort of running parallel, there are opportunities perhaps at the state level, recognizing the difficulty of getting things through on the federal side. There may be just partnership opportunities with your state SBDCs to help them to ramp up as they apply for those fundings. If you're not aware, SBDCs do require a match at the state level to support their operations. And so I think there's an opportunity for a win-win with Main Streets or other resources at the state level that Main Street is a part of to help support their requirement in accessing these funding. So whether it's at the federal level or at the state level, there's $265 million out there. Certainly think there's a great opportunity to expand those resources by leveraging the Main Street network as that link with small businesses. I think that what we're looking at is there's also you need conveners. You need people that are bringing together diverse sides of the spectrum, and one of those that's coming through in the survey is the critical issue around sort of the expense side. So we've been approaching, grants in terms of whether it's been payroll for the most part. But there are some other expense sides of the equation that we think need, at least in the interim, to be looked at and to help with the potential foreclosures. And those are things like rent, utilities, other operating fees that may go along with the business. And so on the state level, and these are primarily state and local level, Main Streets certainly are always, looked at as a convener for many local governments through that interplay between the public sector and the private sector. And we think there's an opportunity here to facilitate conversations at the local level with city officials for everything from utility bills to monthly parking fees or sewer and water fees to certainly understand local governments are struggling as well. But at the end, if we don't keep small business owners, there's a long-term impact versus the short-term impact. We're also seeing what potentially could be some problems between our small business owners that are leasing, which a fair majority do, versus property owners. We need them both. Certainly a big aspect of Main Street is the character of the buildings, the design improvements, the renovations that occur, the management of those buildings, and at the same time the tenants that fill them. And right now, a lot of that effort is going in to support the business owners, and there's talk around rent and suspending rents or whatever. But then property owners need to evaluate their own expenses. And so help with that would be very appreciative as well in terms of either mortgage suspension or deferred property taxes, something that addresses that side of the equation. So I think over time, what we'll start to see are some short-term strategies, maybe deferred rent or reduced rent, or even like a % of sales lease arrangement until things scale back. Just to keep, tenants in the building, again, could be a win-win in the long run versus just a building owner having to sit with a lot of vacancies because they didn't work cooperatively with the small businesses. Thinking ahead in trying to not quickly, but recognizing we're all hoping that we can pivot towards a recovery scenario at some point. And so, one of the least unknown outcomes is what, is there a sort of a new norm that comes out of COVID-19? Will people shop the same way? Will people recreate the same way? Will they come to, special events in crowds? And again, I think this is something that will evolve over time. And so I don't think it's necessarily a one size fits all. And this is something that we're going to continue to try to monitor and how small businesses are responding to that, especially as we see some of the reopening dialogue occur out there. But I think Main Street is rebuilders as we frame that will be further challenged to balance sort of this need between bringing back foot traffic and doing our events and those kinds of things versus, kind of a new world in which we're going to be continually reminded around social distancing and where, because of the stay-at-home or the shut-in home orders, a lot more prevalency of e-commerce. And so how will that sort of dictate how we recover and how we look? And so I think for example, one of the things that that makes us, I think, a little nervous about that is what Mike alluded to when we were talking about e-commerce. The fact that 63% of small business owners that were surveyed indicated they had no e-commerce, platform, no e-commerce sales. And so, how does that relate? Because most likely, people aren't just going to come back and as if nothing changed. And so we have to be prepared. We have to think about how do we better pivot and not just talk about the need to have an online component to bricks and mortar, but how do we actually make that happen as part of our work? So on the state and local level, again, I think we have to be advocates for funding to support different kinds of programming that's going to be more apt to reflect the recovery and the new norms. So that's going to probably impact some of the programming that we do. Maybe, sort of instead of facade grants right now, we're, repurposing those to e-commerce training and grants. Maybe it's about thinking about small scale producers that can have an online component as well as a bricks and mortar, but aren't as dependent upon foot traffic. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion around technology infrastructure planning and how are we going to be involved in that, especially in rural economies. So I think technology is going to become an ever more important of our design thinking. There may very well be sort of safe certifications through CDCs or local public health boards. Do we even think about downtowns being safe downtowns now, or establishing co-op delivery efforts for your district business owners, recognizing that one business owner may not be able to do it on their own. So I think there's some new norms at play here, and so how we pivot to that, irregardless of what we're seeing now with programs like PPP and everything else, I think that's going to be important over time. And so we want to be sure from a programming policy advocacy perspective that state and local officials are recognizing that Main Streets have an incredible important role in helping those small businesses, helping our communities to pivot to those new norms. And then finally, I think we're going to need some experimentation. Fortunately, I think Main Street has a huge track record in this. I mean, if you think about some of the retailing concepts that have been developed over the 40 years and how through so many different changes in the economy and consumer preferences, whether it was shopping malls to big box to e-commerce to lifestyle centers or what have you, we have always pivoted very, very well. And certainly this is going to be a challenge like nothing else. But if anything, Main Street are truly innovators in this. Think about, alleyways going to dining spaces. I mean, that wouldn't even have been thought of years ago, to how you take a pop-up and now it's in like 20 different varieties of how we view pop-up retail concepts. And now all the big stores were trying to use it to experiential shopping. A lot of these things were created by mom and pop retail, by Main Street programs being innovators. And I think that's going to be especially important, irregardless of how this comes out, is that, we're going to need to provide for some room for experimentation and celebrate that. And I think that's the wonderful nature of having a Main Street network in place, is that we do have this ability to share, to learn, to adapt quickly, to be agile, which I think in this sort of a new place, we're going to need more of. And so some of that might entail repurposing our more traditional programming elements, at least in the short and midterm, because it's probably unlikely that you immediately go back and do everything that you've been doing. There's going to have to be some shifts and changes. We're trying to better evaluate what that might look like. Certainly have the American Express. You saw that. We're looking at those applications now. It was on business innovation. We just launched the Grills Fund grant. So please, we're looking at that in terms of organization innovation. So anything that we can do perhaps in reallocating certain funding programming that maybe is less useful in a time like now, not to be critical of facade grants, but there may not be much happening on that front here in the near term or the midterm. So how can we put those resources to use to experiment, to test in really an environment in which we really don't know a lot about? There is no playbook for this. It's not a recovery like normal. And so I think we're going to need to experiment and then, share within our network. So I think I'll turn it over to Mike. I think Mike's going to talk a little bit about how to access your community data, and then we'll have an opportunity to have some, Q&A.
All right, thanks, Matt. So I'll just very, very quickly show you where the interactive maps are, how they work, how you can get data for your community or a community nearby. So let me hope you're seeing an interactive map here. So, and actually so this is within, if you go to Main Street America, go to mainstreet.org, go to the blog viewer, find the data from the impact of COVID-19 blog post, and you can scroll down and see the statewide results map and the local results map. And I'll just very quickly show each of those. I think I will show it on a full screen, although you can interact with it as well, just within that web page. So maybe I'll do statewide first here. Bear with me. There we go, it's loading up. So we're showing in the lighter blue all of those states that had between 5 and 200 respondents, and in this darker blue color, those states that had the most respondents, so more than 200. I think Pennsylvania had the most responses as a state with, let me see here, 603 responses. So you get a sense of how the map works pretty quickly here. You can just click on the state within the state boundaries and get the actual aggregated results for that state. As I say, we aren't showing any data for states where we had fewer than 5 responses. So there's I think 7 states that are excluded there. But for all the other states, you can easily click on it. You can actually cut and paste. I was careful to make this possible. You can just cut and paste the results into Excel, for instance, and it actually formats pretty well. But ideally, you can pull the data yourself and treat this as the report, basically, with just a little formatting. Other features of the map, I think those are the main ones. I've gotten some questions over email already from folks who are noting that the count of survey responses for a community, if you look at, for instance, Nebraska with 11, let's try this as an example. I'm going to pop over to the local summaries map, the local level map, the place-based map. If we look at Nebraska, there's several in Nebraska. Nope, no, there's no communities in Nebraska. Good example. No communities in Nebraska had more than 5 responses. So there were 11 in the state of Nebraska showing on the statewide map. Because there weren't any single communities with 5 responses, you're not seeing any points for Nebraska, but we take all the responses from the state and put them together on the statewide map. So I think I've heard questions from Michigan and Maryland and maybe from Iowa as well. I'm not sure there was a third state that's reached out to me. If the numbers for the individual communities don't add up to the number for the state, that's the explanation why. There are a number of communities where there weren't 5 responses, but we are including those in the statewide results. So looking at the place-based map, similar story. They're showing something like 1,100 or 1,200 points on the map, communities. The blue points are the communities with between 5 and 24 respondents. The orange are the places with the most respondents, so more than 25. I think Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania actually had the most respondents. And then there are a couple points here with Boston and with Oakland County, Michigan, where you can see the city or county level coordinating program. So yeah, you can zoom in, go through the results here, compare to other communities. Again, cutting and pasting works pretty well. So if you want to generate your own sort of report, really would love for folks to take advantage of this map, bring this data to folks at the state level, the local level, federal level, just to advocate for small businesses in your communities and in your states. I'd be happy to talk through some of this more, but I think I'm going to pass back to Kelly. I think I'll leave the map online unless Kelly wants to change it, and maybe get into some Q&A.
The map's great. Let's just leave it there in case we get any questions that we need to dig into. So we have had some robust, conversation in the chat during the program with some questions. So appreciate everybody. Also, just a couple of comments for Mike and Matt. Just that this is super cool, and thanks for this information. So just a heads up that those are the audience's feelings right now as well.
Great.
I want to get into a couple of questions. Maybe Mike, while we're teeing up a first question, if you could just go back through and show again how to get to the map. Just a couple of questions coming in about just where do you get to that.
Sure. Yeah. So let me get my cursor back and come out of full screen here. So if you go to, I'll actually go through the actual steps here. So if you go to mainstreet.org, this is how I've been accessing it, and then come over to Main Street blog, how we can help. And then we have this data from the impact of COVID-19 on small businesses survey data blog post. And you can scroll down. I imagine we'll probably have to put these maps on maybe on the COVID-19 resources page. We'll have them somewhere else so they don't just slowly slide down the blog roll there in case they're still useful. But yeah, you can access the statewide map and the local results map that way.
Thanks so much. One question that has come in that's more perhaps for Matt here. I'm just wondering about the current status of SBDCs and whether or not you've seen any increase in hiring so that we can have more services available to communities. And our question asker notes that her local SBDC is not answering calls or emails because they are swamped.
Yeah, I think that gets back to the first couple slides, is that I can imagine they're overwhelmed. There's 1,200 SBDCs. I can't tell you exactly how many personnel that represents, but given that there is funding, they have the opportunity to apply for that from the SBA. Like I said, there's about $265 million that was allocated to SBDCs, women and minority business centers. The key is that they generally require match, is how they operate, which comes from the state or university or wherever they're housed and how they're local funding. My concern, and that's why I voiced it here as a potential opportunity, I think, for Main Street, is it's going to take a long time in many respects, much longer than I think we have based on the data to ramp up. Hiring process for additional capacity takes time. Now you can contract for some of that, but there's time there. Whereas Main Streets, many of them have had very strong partnerships with their SBDCs. You've got building relationships already with the small business community. I just think there's an opportunity, perhaps through partnering, and it's probably not at the federal level, it's probably with the state SBDC directors, whether through the coordinators or local programs, to think about opportunities that maybe can access some of that funding, but also then engage Main Streets in helping with that, via contract or additional support. So I think that's where I can certainly see the headaches and the frustrations of trying to engage, and certainly don't blame those folks, but the numbers don't lie. There's overwhelming need and not a lot of capacity at the SBDC level right now to probably manage that.
Thanks, Matt. Mike, we had another couple of questions come in just about the next steps with the survey, if we're planning to repeat or follow up in any way. I was wondering if you could address that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I'd forgotten to mention it during my slides, and Matt kind of covered it a little bit. So the last question on the survey that we'd sent out and gotten those 5,800 responses was whether small business owners would be willing to do a follow-up survey. And I was astounded that I think it was more than 4,500 of the 5,800 agreed to express interest in doing a follow-up survey. So in the next few days, I think it might be early next week, we're going to send out a follow-up survey to those 4,500 or so small businesses. Ideally, we're going to keep with that group of small business owners as sort of a cohort and understand over time sort of how they're faring, how they're doing, accessing different programs available, sort of what impacts they've had in terms of continued revenue or lack thereof, and employment and all the rest. So that'll be our next step immediately with the data and the surveying. We've also sent out surveys. There's a survey out there now for Main Street program directors or managers. If you haven't seen that link, we can send that out again. That survey is open through tomorrow at 5 o'clock Pacific. I think we've gotten more than 400 responses so far, so that's terrific. And then we're also going to be sending out very soon a coordinator survey for Main Street coordinating programs to ask about how you're sort of faring, those folks are faring in the midst of all of this. So suddenly we're doing a lot of survey work, and appreciate everyone bearing with us and participating as they have time and resources.
Excellent. So next up, a question that maybe you could both address. It came in from Manuel, and really thinking about the ways that the U.S. response has differed from the response internationally. So Manuel is wondering, based on the fact that other countries like France, UK, Italy are providing direct assistance to small businesses to freeze the economy rather than making small businesses apply for grants or loans and have employees apply for unemployment, what are the chances that we might pivot on how we support small businesses overall rather than just continue funding existing programs?
Yeah, I think the short answer is I just doubt it. The framework, the political framework is not there to pivot. Long term, this is how we've essentially always responded, and I don't think that there's probably the sort of the, I don't know if it's even political will, social will, what have you, to pivot to that sort of framing of how we support small businesses. So I think, this is sort of the deck that we've been, the cards we've been dealt, and we'll just have to respond in the best way we can. But I think that's a huge, just sort of systemic, how America is set up versus other countries. So I don't sense that. I think what we can and perhaps should look at from a recovery perspective is just things that we're learning is part of Europe, Germany specifically, and I think Austria and some other countries, Denmark, Sweden, as they begin to open up. I think there are opportunities to learn about the approach that some of the small businesses are using in that reopening, some of the things that don't require, in essence, like federal policy or even state policy. They're just operational. There may be learnings there. So I think in some ways, those countries may be a week or two ahead of us, at least based on what we know today. There may be learning opportunities. So I think that's a great thing to look internationally as well as what's going on, and then how we might be able to adapt that from a U.S. perspective.
Thanks, Matt, for addressing that. Mike, we've had a couple of questions come in about a sliver of data that is particularly interesting relative to folks that saw an increase in revenue. Is there any, have you dug into that at all, about those smaller groups that were showing that they had actually increased revenue during this time?
It's a good question. It's a researcher kind of question. I've dug into that a little bit, but haven't and you ask the question of the data more directly. I had suspected initially that grocery stores might account for some of that, and then there are some grocery stores that showed a slight increase, but that wasn't the majority of those responses. Some retail responses, I mean, again, it's the number of them is so small, but yeah, I'm going to take a look at that. And I think there may be a blog post in the future for us just digging into the data a little bit more if you're interested in this kind of a thing. Because I also wonder that.
Wonderful. I'm sure that's probably pretty interesting information there. I just want to take one more question before we close out here today. And I think it's an interesting question to be thinking through the value of Main Streets at this time. One of our questioners is asking if there is a way to create a Main Street program during recovery. Is that something that we could be thinking about right now?
Yeah, I think, again, if we look at some of the different eras of economic transition, one of the things that we find if we equate that to entrepreneurship is that generally in some of our sort of worst economic times, if we just look at the Great Recession of 07-08, that's when we had the highest rates of entrepreneurship. I think there's also, so again, being entrepreneurial during those times, we see quite a bit of that. And I think that as we go to the recovery, as we shift to recovery, I think there'll be just tremendous reflection, and that's certainly the hope, I think, of everyone on this webinar with state and local officials, that now's not the time to be cutting on those things that can help with that are so important to managing this recovery. And I certainly think Main Street falls into that. You don't see corporations cutting research and development or new product development, and we're sort of analogous to that on the societal side. So I certainly think moving forward, Main Streets are needed as much as ever in terms of how we think about new uses for what will inevitably be some vacant property, to how people will have a need for social engagement, being cooped up in our homes and apartments and everything else for a long period of time. And so there will be a whole social context that Main Streets are a big part of. There'll be questions and needs for education and training and bringing e-commerce into small businesses and all these things that will be part of a new norm. And I think Main Streets are just well positioned to play a central role in making that recovery possible.
Thanks, Matt. Very wise words to end our program. We do have a few questions that have come in that are pretty specific that I'll just ask that if you didn't have your question answered and you want to email us, please reach out to mainstreet@savingplaces.org. We will follow up with you and make sure the right person responds to your question. Again, there will be a recording of this program available in about 24 hours, available on the COVID-19 resource page for Main Street America. The link at the top of the website that you're seeing on Mike's screen now. So you're able to come back and watch this later. And the survey, of course, the results are available on our page now. So please keep visiting the COVID-19 resource page for more information. And thank you so much for attending today. And thank you, Mike and Matt, for your time and your expertise.
Thanks, everyone. Stay
Thanks
well.
for joining. Yep.